Welcome back to part 2, everybody. Today, let's listen to Anthony talk about his beliefs on religion, history and whether it's factual or not, evolution, and we come up with an experiment that he himself agrees would be evidence of a globe. So that would kind of bring me to my next series of questioning. Why hide it and what are they hiding?
They hide it to support their own existence because science is the ultimate authority of man. You said yourself that you would appeal to other people that were much more intelligent than yourself to demonstrate a particular point. Well, if you were science and you realized that we weren't here because of a cosmic ejaculation where something exploded and matter self. I mean, the number one law, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But if you believe the science, then nothing exploded into everything, which is the creation of life, energy. But that can't happen from nothing because matter can't, like energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but something was created from nothing because we're here. That's what they tell us is how we got here, right? But it's a breach of the first law of thermodynamics. So the reason for why they would hide it is if they got high enough to realize that there was some kind of ceiling, some kind of barrier, or maybe a big set of eyes looking down on you, to justify their own existence, they would hide it because they want us to be subject to man and think that all the answers lies in science. But the reality is, you see it yourself. We have gas pressure. It's an open system. It would immediately fill the available volume. It's the biggest argument against living on a sphere. Now, does that mean I have to prove? If you give me all the money and the rockets, I could probably prove what's up there. But they've got the rockets and the money. So is it more likely that they've got the answers and they're not telling you the answers? Or is it that they genuinely are researching space and all this, but they've got to explain how we've got the gas pressure that we're breathing?
With the hiding of it for science hiding it, but why would they have been hiding it for hundreds of years before the modern era?
To justify their own existence as a body of science,
Then I would
the
say
authority of man,
my
control.
my argument to that though is 400 years ago, what was a stronger organization, the body of science or the church? So why isn't the church behind the flat Earth movement or the globe Earth movement to hide it?
Who says it is or it isn't? I mean, we don't know how the upper epsilons of the society that we live in work, right?
I would say that
It may be, it
the
may not be.
church would be the one funding science and the one funding NASA and doing everything they can to confirm the globe. But when's the last time the church did anything to try and reaffirm to us that we live on a globe instead of a flat Earth?
Why would you think that the church would be funding NASA
Be-
when NASA are the antithesis?
because who 300 years ago, who was stronger, the church or science? Who would you think would win that
Well,
battle?
who's stronger now, the church or science?
Well, it started hundreds of years ago, though. You don't think
Yeah,
that
but who's
one would be
stronger
able to...
now, the church? Who's stronger now, church or science?
Science, I would say.
I don't know. I don't know. I realize that there are many different religions. And when you say the church, are you meaning one particular faith church? But my point is that there is miles more people into religion than there are into science. Yes, there are people into science, and yes, there are extremes into religion. But my point is that I don't know the answer to the question, which is bigger and stronger right now. But when you asked what was bigger and stronger 400 years ago, 400 years ago, I can't find any evidence that we existed 400 years ago because all the evidence indicates that we're very recent. I mean, most of the properties around where I mean, where we have capstones on the properties where I live, and the older properties that indicate that they were built in the 16th century or 15th century, and they've got the date on them. So 1650, for example, when you actually look at the 1650, it's not actually saying 1650. It says I and then 650. It's not saying 1650. The first letter is not actually a number, it's a letter I. Now, I don't know what that means, but what I do realize is that that's a letter, it's not a number. So that makes me wonder, well, it can't be 600, it's not 650, but it must be 1650. But how long ago was that? Because these buildings they are old, but they're not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, maybe 200 years old, but they're indicating that they're a lot newer than what the capstone says. And my point is this: what do we really know happened 3, 4, 500 years ago when you can't really prove what you did 6 weeks ago? Yeah, you might remember, but as those memories fade, how would you prove that on such and such a date you were at that place? How do we know what was bigger back in 400, 500 years ago? Was it science or was it religion? We don't know is the honest answer. That's my answer.
So that opens a new line of inquiry, just so that I can understand your position. What do you think is the reality of history then?
Constructed by man to base. I mean, look at this argument. Sometimes gravity is a force when it suits them. Sometimes gravity is not a force. They tell us that Christopher Columbus discovered America. That's if you look who discovered America. Go onto Google. Who discovered America? The answer you'll find is Christopher Columbus, right? But when you realise that there were Red Indians there before Christopher Columbus didn't discover America.
And he wasn't the first European to set foot over here.
Right, but we're told that. And we're told that Hitler lost the war, World War II, right? Hitler was killed in a bunker. Is that true? How do we know? Well, we're told it, but it doesn't make it true. We're told that Hitler started the war because he invaded Poland. Is that true? And the answer, when you look into it, is Hitler only attacked Poland because the Polish were provoking him and poking him by attacking all of his border towns. And it was a response to being poked by the Poles. So we're told that Hitler started the World War II by invading Poland. But really, he was having to endure the Polish attacking and attacking and attacking and attacking. And in the end, he lost his temper and he attacked them back. The minute he attacked them back, that started World War II. So depending on how you interpret what was actually going on, was it the Poles poking Hitler to start and then the reaction that started World War II, or was it Hitler being the tyrant? And I'm not saying he was one or the other. What I'm saying is that the Poles were attacking Hitler and he reacted. How do you interpret that? I don't know, but that's supposed to be the start of World War II. But what did start it?
I think we can agree that generally the victor gets to write the history of the war, but
right,
big picture, are we hundreds of years old? Are we thousands of years old? What are the gaps that you personally think are not correct?
Well, we're not the first civilization that's ever. We've not had a continuous existence as one civilization on this planet. We're at least the sixth, probably the seventh civilization. There's been 6 or 7 wipeouts in history where it seems to have been reset, and you can see evidence of that in the pyramids. The pyramids were not built by our civilization; they were built by at least 2 or 3 civilizations prior to us. You got the Incas, the Aztecs. You got numerous other different types of civilizations that have lived that are not us. They've got technologies that we don't have. I mean, the pyramids, they can't build the pyramids today out of sandstone. They struggle building like a couple of blocks. Yeah, you might be able to get 25 blokes to move one of the pyramid blocks, but you've got to build something that is gargantuan, and it's the most sturdy structure that's ever been seen on the planet. And we can't do that at the minute because somehow they've managed to turn sand, granular sand, into a concrete somehow, build all these bricks and all that, and make a structure that they tell us is tombs. It's clearly not tombs. They're doing something. There's a physical structure to them. They're doing something. Now, we don't know what they're actually doing, but we're told they're tombs. But when you look into the pyramids, they're clearly not tombs. They're doing something. There's a physical structure. They're doing something. But how many we're not the first civilization that's lived on this planet. There's been resets. What's caused them? Who knows? Did it wipe out dinosaurs? Did dinosaurs even exist? What do you really know? I mean, if you think about your own world, you've got yourself, you've got your parents, you've got your grandparents that you'll probably remember from being a kid, and then you might have a great grandparent or two. But beyond your great grandparents, what do you actually know about your linear family history? You might be able to go back another couple of generations, but how far back can you realistically go before you can demonstrate that you can prove or you can no longer prove where you came from? And there'll be a point that you can no longer prove where you came from, but you exist. So you've got to come from somewhere. But where did you come from with your family? You can't go, you can only go back so far. But we know that we can only go back so far, but we believe that we know everything that happened in the history of the world. But no, we're not the only civilization that's lived on this earth.
Do you think that's also being covered up?
I don't know. I just think it's lost information over time. Entropy, isn't it? Intelligence is always reducing to its lowest common state, and if entropy applies to information as not a knowledge in the same way as it does to constructs. So heritage. I mean, like I said, your grandparents. What did your grandparent do for a living? You don't know. You know he existed because your grandparents gave your great grandparents gave your grandparents gave your mum and dad, and then you exist. So you know they existed. What did he do for a living? You don't know. But that information, you could probably find it out. But it's been lost for you. But if you can only go back so far. So how much can you prove? You just have to believe a lot of it.
So you have a doubt of history's accuracy. Would that be accurate to say?
History is written by the winner, right?
True. Shit, I just had a thought. I can't think of what it was now.
That's okay.
Yeah, I remember I can't remember what it was because it was kind of down that line of thinking as well. Um, yeah, the information. So, oh yes, religion. So that's generally one thing that most people will insert at some point into this argument. If I may, what are your religious beliefs, your religious history, and your stance on it currently?
I was brought up Christian. I went to Sunday school every Sunday until I was about 15, and then I was given the choice, and I chose not to go back. It didn't do any harm. I wasn't brought up radicalized. I wasn't brought up to believe that everybody else are infidels. I was brought up to believe that everybody else should be treated with respect, and you should live and let live. Love thy neighbor, do all the good things. And if you want to dress up in trans gear and pretend that you're a cow or a sheep, that's your choice. And as long as you're not interfering with me, I'm not going to have a problem with it. I might think that you're an idiot, but I'm not going to like start attacking you for it because I believe that you're an infidel. My view on religion is that there is a place for religion in society. I'm not religious myself. I realize that we must be here as a result of creation, because if you think about DNA, do you accept that DNA exists?
I do.
And if you're apparently there's enough information in one strand of DNA that it would take up something like 36 terabytes worth of drive space or whatever. DNA exists. It's been coded by something. Where did the code come from to make the DNA? Something's coded it, right? Now, I'm not saying it's God or otherwise, but I'm saying that that is a reflection of intelligent design because that information exists because we have DNA. So the code that makes the DNA has to have been coded by somebody or something that is of a higher intelligence than us because it exists. That coding did take place. Somebody programmed it, right? So I accept that DNA exists. I accept that it has to have been coded by somebody or something or intelligent design of some kind. But I'm not religious. I just realize that there has to be something above us, be it God or otherwise.
Okay. Um, what part do you think that plays in the flat Earth? Do you think the Bible is a book of the flat Earth, or do you just there's got to be a creator for the enclosed system?
I, there's got to be a creator for an enclosed system because you can't have a decrease in entropy without intelligence. Entropy increases, but to decrease entropy, it has to be input from energy's got to go into something to create something. So if we existed as a splodge in the infinite vacuum of space, for that Big Bang explosion to exist, something has to have gone, the energy has to have been put into it to create the explosion in the first place. Because that decrease in entropy always increases, but the decrease in entropy has to be caused by somebody or something adding energy to that system for it to work. It has to happen. So that increase in knowledge or input, energy creation going into it. I mean, if I was God and I looked down on a section of my plane underneath, if I was in heaven looking down and I decided I'm going to put an Earth there, I can see logically that I might make an explosion or an implosion to create the Earth that we're now living on. I can see the logic in that. But then the for me would be, well, that explosion, if that was the moment of inception from a God's perspective, a creator's perspective, that is being interpreted by science as the Big Bang Theory. But that might be the inception of creation itself. So I'm not saying that the Big Bang didn't happen. I'm saying that the interpretation of it might be that it's purely based on a scientist perspective, but it could also be interpreted to be the moment of creation, the inception of creation, the inception of our world by an intelligent design that we're only looking at it from a universe perspective, but really we should be looking at it at the bigger picture. Because if I was God and I wanted to create a little ball and put people on it, I would create probably an explosion. Because if you think about it, if you go back to the days of like Command and Conquer or Warcraft, when you put your first object down on your plane, your terrain that you're playing at that particular moment, there's usually a and it'll put it down for you and it's there. That is presumably, and you could interpret that to be the creation of our world. Now, I'm not saying it is, but I think that the role that religion plays in flat Earth is that it justifies people that have a religious view to take a radical and extreme like direction or course and base it on their belief in their God or whatever. And that's an extreme position. I think it generally is counterproductive. I think that we should base a lot more of our world views on evidence, not on religion or on science, because a lot of science is scientism. I mean, look at the definition for pseudoscience. It
Yeah,
is the
I've seen your
belief
videos
of
on
the.
that. Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
have
yeah.
Do you
I
have any
mean,
examples of what you just mentioned where the radicalized religion in flat Earth has been detrimental? Anything specifically that kind of sets you off on you're wrong for doing what you're doing?
um, there are, and it works on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
There is a big there is the perception by ballers is that if you believe we're created, you must be religious. That's not true. I believe that we're created by something, God or otherwise. It could be just intelligent design, but I believe that we are created devoid of any religion. Because when you say it's religion, you're basically asking somebody to pick a team. You're on the red team, the blue team, the green team, the yellow team, right? You're picking a side, be it Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or whatever. You're picking a team, right? The minute you do that, then you're aligning yourself with a set of ideals, a set of rules, a set of behaviors that is acceptable in that particular religion, right? You shouldn't do that. I don't think that that's the right way to do it. I think that you should take an omnipotent view of all of the religions and consider them like collectively, not indiscriminately. Because if you take one of them only and adopt to it and ascribe to it, that's the reason why the Muslims are all fighting amongst themselves. Like Kurds and the Shiites are all fighting amongst each other. I mean, there's about 10, 12 different types of Muslim, and they've all got different interpretations of parts of the Quran that make them different and unique to their own interpretation. But that's why they're all fighting. But they're all Muslim. And it's like, so what's really going on there? Is it that we're being compartmentalized by this thing called religion? And the bigger picture is that we are created by something that's beyond us, and we shouldn't have any religions. But they want us to, it's almost as if they want us to be fighting amongst each other in something. They don't want us to be getting on in harmony. Because if we get on with each other in harmony, then wars don't exist, and the economy can't. They need wars to create jobs, to create war is part of an economic drive, and they do want us to be disagreeing with each other because that empowers the state then to take control and dominate and police us because we can't police ourselves. No, we can police ourselves, but you just can't be part of a religion because if the minute you put yourself in a team, red team, blue team, green team, then teams have got ideals, and that's where the problems for me start. So I realize that we're created. I don't ascribe to any religion. I think that all religions are generally bigoted because you all have a blinkered view of what you're told is your religion. So that religion for me is a simile for bigotry. Religion and bigotry are the same word.
Yeah, you don't have a common view of religion for most of the flat earthers that I have talked with. I'll say that.
I when I went to university, I learnt more in university outside of the university campus than I did inside it. I learnt the law inside university, but I learnt multiculturalism outside of it. For example, in my halls of residence, I had a Bohemian woman, I had a guy from Trinidad, I had a guy from Tobago, I had a girl from Spain, and I had a girl from Greece. So from where I was, I had people from all corners of the earth. You can't have corners of the earth on a sphere, but anyway, I had people all over the place.
There's no
And
corners on that
first,
either.
yeah, yeah, well, yeah, maybe. I can see three corners, but anyway, I went down the corridor on my first day, and I was the last one there because my course started 2 weeks after everybody else, and I was the last one in. And I walked in at tea time, and they were all in there, and they all had 2 weeks where they all got to know each other, and I was the newbie. And basically, the Greek girl was a white girl, the Spanish girl that was a white girl, but the Trinidad, the Tobagan, and the Nassau girl from the Bahamas were all black. And I say black, I don't mean half caste, I mean black. And I walked into the kitchen, and I'm presented with five, six people that I've not met before, and I was like, holy shit. And I didn't know what to do because I'd never been in a situation where I had multiculturalism before. And you've got to get on with these guys because you've got to hope that they're not going to attack you because you're a white boy, and they're going to hope that I'm not going to attack them because they're the black people or whatever. And instantly, I had this immediate perception that race might be a thing, and it lasted for about 10 minutes. And then I realised that race isn't a thing, and we all ended up drinking rum. That's why I drink rum, because rum now is me regressing back to my university days when people were bringing rum that you couldn't buy in the supermarkets because it was like stronger and it tasted better and it was made with spices that don't exist in England. But these people were bringing rum in all the time, like probably like illegal stuff. I don't know what it was, but it was nice, and we were all drinking rum. So very quickly, I assimilated into a multiculturalism I found was fantastic. So forget about learning law in class. I was drinking rum all the time with my colleagues, my peers, and that taught me that we don't have to hate each other based on sex, creed, race, religion. Religion, everybody had a different religion, but we all had that common understanding that there's got to be something created us, because how did we get here? What came first, the chicken or the egg? You can't get nothing from some. You can't get something from nothing unless it's created, because it can't exist. You know what I mean? There's got to be input going into it. You've got to reduce the entropy to be able to create something. Otherwise, the matter would never exist. That simple organisms concept, where eventually we fish, and then eventually monkeys, and then eventually man. That's a decrease in entropy. That defies the second law of thermodynamics. Evolution doesn't exist. Doesn't happen. Yes, we have variations within a species, but dogs are always going to be dogs. Kent Hovind's right when he says that dogs will never become badgers. It's of the same kind is right. Dogs will always be dogs. Yeah, you may get manipulation within that species of dogs, but they're still going to be dogs. They're never going to become cats. They're always going to be dogs. So I realize that the chicken and the egg argument is, although it's it's epistemological in most aspects. The chicken and the egg arguments, when you have multicultures in a university environment where everything transcends the race, the sex, the religion, everything goes above that. The answer to the question is it has to be intelligent design of some kind, be it God or otherwise, because we exist. You can't have a decrease in entropy unless you're putting something into it. And if there's nothing there to put into it, what's creating us? I mean, what's your view? Do you think that we were created, or do you think that we resulted from a cosmic ejaculation?
I wouldn't use those exact words, but I'm an atheist. I was raised Christian, baptized, went to Bible school, all that good stuff as a kid. I was a Lutheran, and in my early adulthood, while I was in the military, I slowly lost my faith.
I could say the same thing. I lost my faith. But what I see that as is, rather than saying the phrase "I lost my faith," I would describe it as losing my allegiance with one particular religion and realizing that there's a bigger picture. It's not limited to that team. If you pick the blue team or the red team, then what you're gonna find is conflict, because everyone's conflicted, because everyone's on a different path, right? But if you're able to take yourself out of that conflict and make yourself omnipotent so that you pervade all of them, you put yourself as God rather than as a servant. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. What I mean is, if you remove yourself from the necessariness of picking a side, you can then pervade all of them and say, well, I mean, I've had conversations with guys that were Islam, and it gets really volatile really quick if you're affiliated to one of the teams that's not Islam. But if you're agnostic and you say, I'm neither one nor the other, then they don't see you as a threat. Mm-hmm. So you can have a normal conversation without it being personal, without it being designed to win and lose. And you agree to disagree at the end of it. And that's the best way to be, I find.
Yeah, mine, it was a loss of faith. It wasn't a disavowing of a single team. And I know you'll probably disagree, but this will actually lead into my next line of questioning a little bit. I lost my faith after September 11th. And ironically, it had nothing to do with September 11th. I was in the military at the time, and after the attacks, we started guarding everything on base, from the post exchange to the food supply area to the garrison headquarters to the hospitals. So I spent about 6 months doing nothing but standing in front of buildings day and night, guarding against terrorists. And standing there gave me a lot of time to just think. And I was on night shift a lot, and I looked up at the stars every night, started studying astronomy, started studying physics, started learning about what science says the lights above us are, and slowly came to the conclusion that if all of this information is correct, it doesn't necessarily comport with a creator. And over about 2 years, I kind of talked myself out of religion.
Sure. I mean, I did the same thing. I didn't lean towards science to talk myself out of religion. I leaned myself more towards the humanity side of it because of my experience at university, where I learnt more outside of the university than I did inside of it. But I realized that humans have the ability to coexist against each other, or with each other, but without being against each other. And when you realize that, it means that your enemy then doesn't become your enemy anymore. He might not be your friend, but he's not your enemy.
Yeah.
And that's because you can step back from it and you can say, I'm not affiliated with the blue team. Yeah, I understand the blue team, but I understand that you've got your red team too. And then when you realize that there's that tolerance that you can achieve by being objective, then immediately you don't have this animosity. You don't have this desire to kill each other because you don't want to win. It's more about being
winning as a whole.
What's the word? Tolerant. Yeah, to be neutral. And I find that by being neutral, you achieve far more. You can have conversations with people where if I'm on a particular side, red team, blue team, yellow team, then you are not going to be able to have that conversation because they'll see you as a threat. Well, I removed that by not being a threat and just said, look, I don't really have one. Talk to me. And I found that it's amazing that you can have 6 people in a room from different parts of the world, all with different cultures, all with different backgrounds, all with different experiences. But the one common thing that we can all talk about is, how did we get here? Because it transcends the religion side of it. And ultimately, even if you start talking about the religion, you end up in a position where by the end of the conversation, you either agree to disagree respectfully, or you all end up saying, we don't know where we came from. Now, whichever way around it goes, you don't end up fighting because you can be neutral. But if you go in there with the mentality of my team's better than your team, you're going to be fighting within 10 minutes.
And you know that basic philosophy is the reason I'm talking to you today. That
okay,
let's just talk. I accept that we're probably not going to agree on a lot of things, but as long as we don't come at it forcefully and bash each other over the heads with the banners of our team, we can at least have a decent, rational, human conversation.
I think the ability to converse is the most important thing between humanity, because I think a lot of things are misinterpreted if we're unable to successfully communicate. You can look at one person's actions and think they've only done that because blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But if you actually ask them and say, why did you do that? They'll say, well, why do you want to know? And then you say, because I think you might have done it for a particular reason, and I want to see what the reason was to see if I can understand, and I might have this wrong. And then they'll say, I did it because I wanted to, or whatever. And then you find out the other perspective, and you realize that maybe you got it wrong. Mm-hmm. You'd joined dots that weren't previously joinable. You'd come to the wrong conclusion, and all you have to do is ask. Most people will talk to you if you don't approach them like an asshole.
Yeah, the conversation piece is absolutely key, and it is a downfall of a lot of discourse in society. And I think one thing that's very important that I try and practice every day with every conversation I have is, have you ever heard of the principle of charity?
Charity? In what context?
The principle of charity. Basically what it means is, when you're observing the actions of another person, your assumption should be that their actions were done with the best possible intentions, rather than assuming they're doing it for a negative reason.
I'm not familiar with that description, or that description there that you just given, but what I've learned is that if you make the assumption in almost all aspects of life, you generally assume wrong, which is where they're saying, if I assume, I make an ass out of you and I, which is true, because I never understood that until I was a young adult, but assume is ass, and then you and I, and assume is in there somehow. I'm not quite sure. I might have butchered the... Yeah, there you go, that's it. So basically, when you realize that you jump to conclusions and it causes problems, the minute you realize that jumping to conclusions causes problems, that's when you kind of realize that the world doesn't revolve around you, and everyone's got their own perspective and they do their things based on their own reasonings, and you don't know their reasoning. You see the consequence and you put 2 and 2 together, but you don't know why they've done it, and you can only assume, and that's the problem with the assumption. So you're better off just asking and just saying, why did you do that?
That's the basis for the principle of charity, is that when you make that initial assumption, because as you said, most of the time your assumptions are going to be wrong, that's when you need to stop and think, okay, this person did X. The best case scenario, when they were trying to be a good human being, when they were trying to do the right thing, was it a mistake? Was it a problem? Was it an error? That's what I should assume they're doing. I should have assumed that they did this with the absolute best intentions. I should not assume that they were doing it to get back at me or to cause problems.
Yeah, I generally agree. I mean, you don't even have to assume that they're doing it with the absolute best of intentions, but they've just got their own reasons for why they did it. And them reasons can vary day to day depending on what kind of mood they're in. It depends on how they're financial. I mean, we all have our own reasons for doing stuff, and you never know. But if you were to ask somebody, why did you do that? And then if they're going to give you an honest answer, you'd be surprised. Most of the time you'll be wrong. You thought they were doing it for a reason that they weren't actually doing it for.
And you probably spent 10 minutes really pissed off at them for no reason.
Yeah, and all you have to do is pick up the phone and ring them and ask them, just say what, because me and Nathan do it regularly. We'll talk to each other, and then somebody will come to me and say, Nathan said this, and they'll go to Nathan and say that Riley said that. And then you ring him and say, what's all this about? And then Nathan will say something like, oh, it's been spun or whatever. And when you know the explanation for it, it just diffuses completely any questions that were there. And it's like, but if I hadn't have asked him, I'd have been festering it and harboring it. It'd have been in the back of my mind. Is he turning against me? And all that paranoia. Just ring and ask. And if he doesn't want to tell you, he'll not tell you. But you're better off asking and knowing the answer, or asking and not being told the answer, because then just speculating as to what the reason was.
Back to my last the conversation I was having about how I lost my faith, specifically looking at the sky. If you haven't guessed, I have a list of questions. I'm trying to ask everybody the same basic questions to get an understanding of each person's positions. What do you think we are actually looking at when we look up in the sky?
Clock, proof of creation.
But I mean, physically, what am I looking at when I'm looking at the stars? What do you think that is?
A mechanism. Are you familiar with the Antikythera mechanism?
Yes.
So that Antikythera mechanism is basically a representation of the sky, but in a clock format, and that's where they get a lot of the cosmological predictions from. I don't quite know how they interpret it, but I believe that's where they get a lot of the predictions from. We're looking at a frequency. We're looking at a construct. It's a construct that's probably metaphysical, and I don't know how it's created, but I realize that these lights in the skies can only ever be ascertained to be lights in the skies. We're not able to get to them, and we can't orbit them. We can't land on them with rockets. For me, it's supernatural, and it's the proof that it's somehow created, and it goes beyond our ability to comprehend. Because a lot of people can't understand how the stars can move around us like a mobile, like a planetarium, without it being a construct of some kind. Because it kind of has to be a construct. They just can't get their head around that how that can possibly exist without it being God, and they don't want to believe that it's God. And I'm not saying it is God. But the minute you say that the stars are moving around us and we're geocentric in the sense that it's moving around us and we're the center of the world or the universe, then that instantly invokes God, right? But really, it should invoke creation. We were created. This earth that we're living on is designed for us. It's special to us for a reason. It's not a coincidence. It's not the Goldilocks zone. It's been created for us to live in. And that's why we're here. We're here. I think the main reason for why we're here is basically to experience time. That's the purpose of life, I think.
So with the stars in the sky and everything that you can see through a telescope, is there a reason that God would make it as predictable as it is?
Prove that it's construct rather than to prove that it's like random.
If it wouldn't, well, but I mean, it fits with this scientific belief, my side, which we won't necessarily have to go into at this point again. But you accept that what we see in the sky at night is regular, is predictable, is generally constant.
Sure, but you can predict the hands of a clock. You know what the hands of a clock are going to do.
True, but at some points a clock stops.
Only because it runs out of batteries, right?
Then the system hasn't run out of batteries. For the sky, I would say.
Yeah, but just because we can predict the nature of the sky in the same way that we can predict the predictive nature of a clock, doesn't mean that the sky itself is orbits, planets, space. For me, it's the proof that it's created. Because I mean, look at the moon. What is the moon? Is it a space rock that we can land rockets on?
That's one of my next questions. Is what do you think the sun or the sun and the moon are? Do you think they're physical objects or projections or?
I think the sun is a focal point of light in the sense that when we were young, when you were a kid and you got a magnifying glass, you could set fire to ants, right?
Yep.
You did that, right? Well, that focal point puts a little white spot on the floor. Well, imagine that you're the ant on the underside of the white spot, and you're looking up and seeing the white spot that you perceive to be a sun. Well, we're the ant on the underside, and we're seeing the white point, because that's what the sun is. It's a white focal point of light. How? I don't know, but I realize that the sun's not. For me, the sun's not tangible. It doesn't triangulate on either model. I know that the Ball Earth has claimed that it triangulates on their model, and it proves that it has to be a distant sun. But when you look at actually, if you go to the vernal equinox, one of the equinoxes, right, and you go on to the heliocentric model that they describe as constellarium, and then you go to any part of go to the extremities, you'll see that in the middle that the sun rises due east and sets due west for all people that are in the middle. But if you go to the extremities of the maps and test it to see whether it rises due east and sets due west, it doesn't. It's a degree and a half out. And it's like, well, that over 93 million miles misses the sun completely. Now, this was first presented to me by Cara Diane. She's not in the discussion anymore, but she claimed that the vernal equinox proved that the sun has to be 93 million miles away, or at least far away, because it rises due east and sets due west for everybody. So she demonstrated it by picking somebody in America, and I said, go up to like northwest Alaska, and then go down to southeast New Zealand or southwest of Argentina. You know, the four corners of the whatever, and they didn't rise due east and set due west. Now, that's really important if you believe that the vernal equinox proves that we live on a sphere Earth, because all points must rise due east and set due west, and it doesn't do it. But that's an issue. And the other point is two observers looking south at the same time. You've got to have somebody in South America, and you've got to have somebody in South Australia somewhere looking south at the same time, seeing the same stars, but rotated in a slightly different pattern. They'd be the same stars, but they would have to be looking south at the same time. But that evidence doesn't exist, because we've got something called declination, magnetic declination. So because that adjustment exists, the question becomes, why does that adjustment exist? And they say it's because the magnetic poles shift. Well, if the magnetic poles are not shifting the way we're told, and the compass is really showing what is south, then there is no adjustment necessary, and the continents then don't line up. So it seems that compasses are being overridden by science telling us that there is a magnetic shift, but we don't know that there's a magnetic shift. We're just told that. So, and they said, but it's moving every day. Well, okay, but is it not also the case that if the Earth is a flat plane and the celestial bodies are going around us at the top, and it's a lateral orbit rather than like a circular orbit, if the continents are not lining up to these constellations and we're told to correct for it for declination, if we don't correct for it for declination, is it not the case that these things don't line up the way we're told? That evidence is essential if we live on a sphere. Now, if that evidence existed, I would accept that we were on a sphere, but that evidence doesn't exist, and it's explained away with declination. And I'm like, that's not good enough. That doesn't prove that, because you have to be on a ball. If you're looking south and both people are looking in the same direction on a ball, they've got to see the same set of stars, but they would be turned slightly. They'd be in the same direction, and they would be the same stars. That evidence is missing, and I'm like, that's really important.
I'm confused by that. I want you to explain that more, because I actually wrote that down earlier when you mentioned it, the Southern Stars. What evidence is that missing? Because people in South America, people in South Africa, people in Australia, when they look at the direction south, they all see the same stars, whereas on a map such as that, they're looking in absolute opposite directions. So explain to me more what you're talking about with that absent evidence for the Southern Stars.
So you just made a claim then, right? Now, not that I'm going to say prove your claim, but you said that on a sphere, the guy in the south, in America, looking south and seeing the same set of stars as the guy in Australia can only happen on a sphere, right?
Yes.
It can't happen on a flat map. You've got it on the wall behind you. It can't happen on a flat map.
Correct.
Right, and I agree. But in the real world, with real world evidence, there is no evidence that shows that an observer in the south of America and an observer in the south of Australia or New Zealand, when looking due south at the same time, see the same set of stars just rotated. That evidence doesn't exist. And we know it doesn't exist because magnetic declination adjusts for something that we're told is magnetic declination. But I believe that the magnetic declination is simply the adjustment for the fact that the continents don't line up south.
But the problem,
which they wouldn't do on a sphere.
The problem then would be, to me, so even if that magnetic declination is wrong, if we take South America and we have one of those has to be true south, would you say that would be correct?
What are you going to use to denote true south?
Well, just for hypothetical, one of those points has to be true south, correct?
No. What is true south? Let's define what is true south.
The opposite of the North Pole.
Okay. So how are we going to determine where the North Pole is relative to the observer?
For a thought experiment, would you say, though, that rather than going into the semantics of everything, one of those points has to be true south, correct? Directly south of the North Pole.
Well, you need to determine, are you going to get a compass to tell you where north is?
In some way, compass, land survey, something. But you would generally...
Okay, so let's go with the compass just to make the point, right? Let's go with your line of thought. You get an observer in South America and you get an observer in Australia, and you get them to line up with the compass to tell you where north is.
Mm-hmm.
Both people are going to point to a particular bearing on the horizon and say that's north.
Mm-hmm.
But actually north is through the floor because they're pretty much antipodal to the North Pole. So you've got the compass that's giving you a lateral point on the horizon of a bearing, but actually north is through the floor. So how are we going to establish north?
Well, I want to talk about the flat Earth map and how it would be observed. So
What flat Earth map?
a model something similar to that.
But we can also have a Gauss-Peterson projection that doesn't represent it that way, right?
I don't know which one that one is.
It's the square one, the rectangular map that's got the looping sun.
I don't think I know if I've seen that one. I'll have to look that up.
Oh, so the Gauss-Peterson projection, it's just basically the opposite of the AE map. Instead of it being round a square like a dartboard like you've got behind you, it's just the normal map that we normally see, the Gauss-Peterson projection. So you're not familiar?
No, I'll look it up when we're done. But so let me try and understand you, because I think we're talking about different things, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So when someone in one of those three locations is looking at the southern stars, what is your claim that they are looking at and the direction they're looking? Are they looking at the same physical things?
I don't know. I don't make a claim that they're looking at because I haven't seen evidence that proves that they are. I know that you said yourself on the ball model they've got to be looking at the same stars, right? And that is true on the model. But is it true real world? And what I'm saying to you is that there is no evidence that shows that they are looking at the same stars, just rotated. But they've got to be looking south. There's no other. If it's not south, then something else is going on. But the question becomes, well, how are you going to work out south? You've got to have an absolute reference point, right?
Correct. That's kind of what I was going for. If we're looking at the AE map, and if we're just going to, for this argument, assume that this is the model, that one of those points on the southern hemisphere is in a direct line between the North Pole, that point, and the southern star. Correct? One of them has to be.
On the AE map?
On the AE map, yes.
Well, one of them may be, but we don't know that, do we? The only thing we've got as an absolute reference point is the compass. But that absolute may not even be absolute. You've got the perception of the stars and the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and the moon rising in the east and setting in the west. We're told these, but the directions, up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards, are all relative to the human. They're relative. They're not absolutes. So what we're doing is we're trying to find an absolute reference point to demonstrate that the two, because if you're in, let's say you're in America, South America, and I'm in Australia, and we're both looking at the horizon, how do I know that you're looking at the same point on the horizon, the same direction, the bearing that I'm looking at? How do I know that you're doing it the same? There is no absolute reference point that we can both use.
So
the only thing we've got that gives us an indication that might be absolute is the compass, but we're told that it's not because it's subject to declination, right? So if it's subject to declination, that makes it not it's not absolute. It's relative. It's relative to your position on the globe.
It is relative, and with that declination, the point I was trying to make is that if there is a spot that is accurate, that the spot on the map where you're standing is in a direct line between the North Pole and the Southern Pole Star. The Southern Pole region, because there isn't really a Southern Pole Star, that spot rotates on itself. Would you accept that in the sky?
Sure, but you said if there was one spot.
Would there be,
that's the big question.
Would there be multiple?
Well, is there even one? Because you need to. What we're discussing is we're differentiating between an absolute reference point, which we assume exists, over a relative direction point, which we're told is what the compass is.
But I would say there is somewhat of an absolute reference point, maybe not directly North Pole to South Pole alignment, but when you're in one of those spots in the South Pole and you have a telescope that doesn't move and it is affixed to the Southern Pole region, that telescope doesn't have to pan throughout the day ever, and you could leave it there till eternity, and it will constantly be pointing at that Southern Pole star. So whatever it's looking at in the sky, the region.
What Southern Pole star?
The region of the Southern Pole stars, because there is even Polaris isn't directly north, but there is a spot in the sky that doesn't move; it just spins. Do you accept that?
No. We see circumpole. We see what they called. What's the word when the stars are all concentric? We see concentric circles in the north when we look at the North Star. They're perfect concentric circles, but they appear to be egg-shaped when we're looking in the south. Now, I don't know why that is.
I've never seen.
Have you not noticed?
Yeah, I've never seen anybody claim that the Southern Pole stars were egg-shaped.
Look at Southern Star. Look at Southern skies, like time-lapse photography, long exposure photography. You'll see that it's not. They're not perfect circles. They appear to be egg-shaped. That's not consistent with a sphere.
I would agree with that, but I've never seen that.
Give me one sec.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree that that would be evidence against a spherical Earth, but I've never seen that. I've never heard anybody claim that the southern pole stars don't make perfect circular arcs in the sky for long exposure.
So 3 years ago, when I first came to this topic, that was one of the first things I looked up. I looked up like long exposure or time lapse photography of the south, and what I found was that they were cam shaped, they were oval shaped, right? They were not concentric. Now, when you go to it 3 years on, 2019, you see that the North Stars and the South Stars, you can't even tell the difference between them. And that's what, do you know Antonio Subirats?
Yeah.
So Antonio Subirats made the mistake that was touted against him as misidentifying the North rotation point from the South rotation point, because he described one of them as being the North, and they said it was actually the South. And Antonio didn't make a mistake. Antonio identified that there was a rotating star in the center, which is consistent with the North, and they were concentric circles. But what's happened is it's changed now. The evidence is on YouTube now for the rotation star points in the South are no longer the same as what they were at the start of this discussion. They're now concentric circles. But when Antonio first made that observation, or he made that identification, they weren't like that. And that's why Antonio said that that was the North, not the South. Well, they said it's not, because we can show these telescopes line up in this and prove that it's in the South. But Antonio was looking at the concentric circles and the central star and deducing that that must be the North Pole. Now, what I'm saying is that, and I'm not a fan of Antonio at all. I don't get on with Antonio. But what I'm saying is that I understand absolutely why Antonio's made that mistake, and it's because they're changing what we're looking at online for the concentric circles of the pole stars in the south, because they never used to be like that. So Antonio's misidentified something that was never represented the way that they'd shown it. That was the turning point for when they changed it to be concentric circles in the south.
Now,
it never used to be like that.
When you say they changed that, what do you mean? What did they change, and where did they change it?
It went from being egg-shaped star trails to concentric circles with a spot in the middle, which is denoting Sigma Octantis. Well, that doesn't exist real world. You can't see Sigma Octantis real world. It's a very low magnitude star. It's a 4.6 magnitude star, and they say that you can't see it with optical telescopes or whatever because they're not good enough. Apparently, you can only see it with the naked eye. I wrote to the Astronomical Society of Tasmania, and I asked them, could they demonstrate with photographic evidence that Octantis was visible in the sky? And they wrote back to me and said, no, because you can only see it with your naked eye, and you've got to squint, and you can't look square at it. You've got to look to the side of it, and your peripheral view picks it up. And I said, but you can't get it with photography. And they said, well, we can try for you, but you can't really get it. And I said, I want to see proof that Sigma Octantis even exists, because it's such a low magnitude star. They say we can't even see it. Well, if we can't see it, how do we know it's there? Well, you'd have to appeal to authority. You'd have to go to an astronomical society and ask them, can you prove it? So when I did that to the Tasmanian Astronomical Society, they couldn't prove it. They sent me back a picture and they told me that that's what you're looking at, and there's no star there. And I'm like, well, how do we know that Sigma Octantis even exists? And they say, well, they can do it with infrared telescopes, but we don't have any of them ourselves. Only NASA have got stuff like that. So what that then means is that we don't have a rotating star that, unless we go through NASA with their big telescopes, which could be falsified and we can't verify it ourselves, but we believe it's there, and it may be there, but I don't know whether it's there or not. But what I'm saying is that the bigger picture here is, if there is a rotation point in the night sky in the south, it has to be south for both observers in Australia and America. If it's not due south for both observers in America, it's not a ball. Now, we know that it can't be due south because they give us something called declination, magnetic declination adjustment. That means that you can override your compass and tell you that the compass is not telling you the correct direction, which points to a point on the horizon, but really it should be pointing through the floor. But we have the compass, but we're told to make an adjustment for declination. So that tells me that we're not actually looking south. We need to be looking 15 degrees away from south. But if the Earth's a flat plane and the continents can't line up with the south rotation point, then that is actually a flat Earth proof, because you shouldn't have to correct for declination, because the compass should be telling you an absolute reference point. But they've made the absolute reference point of a compass a relative reference point by introducing something called declination. So what is the absolute reference point we can use in the south to denote that you're looking at the same point in the horizon that I'm looking to, and that the evidences are corroborating each other? And the answer is, well, that evidence doesn't exist. We can't do it because we haven't got an absolute reference point. You can tell me that there's an absolute reference point if you want to, but it isn't, because up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards, they're all relative to the human. So we don't have an absolute reference point. We may have an absolute reference point if magnetic north can be accepted to be an absolute reference point, but we're told that it's subject to declination. So that makes it relative to the point that you are on the plane, whether it be a ball or not. They're telling us it's relative. So ultimately, it reduces back to the question, is a compass an absolute reference point for you and me in that position or not? And if you're on a ball, it's a relative position because it's subject to declination. From my perspective, I look at the compass and say, can I trust the compass? I don't know if I can trust it or not, but I can't trust the people that are telling me to adjust for declination because I don't trust them on any of the other things. So why should I trust them on declination now? So if we go with my perception that the compasses are an absolute reference point and we can deduce our north on a flat plane, we're looking at the horizon and that's where north is. It's not through the floor because we're obviously not antipodal. The North Pole on a sphere is below our feet, right? But if me and you've got a compass and we both line it up to the horizontal and we look to the horizon and yours is saying it north that way and mine's saying north that way and we flip it 180 degrees and now we're looking south, if I can accept that that's an absolute reference point for you and I for this purpose, then they're going to either line up or they're not. But the evidence doesn't exist for us to be able to make a conclusion. But everybody thinks that the Southern Stars proves globe, but there's no evidence that proves that that's true. Because if it did exist, I'd be on that side of the fence. It's a massive, massive hole in the argument.
Can you determine absolute east and west through the sun transit, sunrise, sunset?
Well, you have to accept that the Earth's tilted because east and rise in the east and setting in the west changes every day because of the orbit of the Earth going around the sun.
Well,
and that's caused
talking,
by the tilt.
Yeah, on a flat Earth, is there any way to determine just from the sun, east, west, north, south? Stick in the ground, watching the shadow, something, would you be able to determine absolute north and south?
The problem you've got is the ecliptic path of the sun. The sun itself, although it goes round, the way I see it, it goes round the flat plane, but because the circular path that the sun takes, the path itself moves around. That's the ecliptic plane on a flat Earth. Because of the path of the circular motion and the ecliptic path of the sun, you probably could work it out, but it would be relative to the time of the year. But it wouldn't be an absolute; it'd be relative to the time of the year. But on the heliocentric model, it'd be relative to the tilt of the Earth to the time of the year.
So what I would propose then is if you picked on one of the equinoxes, 12-hour day, stick in the ground of some format measurable to determine that you are at absolute perfectly perpendicular, and measure the shadow throughout the day, because then if you measured shadow from sunrise to sunset, you would get an arc, correct?
Yeah.
You should be able to, if you calculate that and you had a full day of sun, no shadow, actually at sunrise and sun yet you didn't have shadow, and you had that full arc of the sun, would you accept that as being able to determine north and south as the midway point using geometry on it?
On that one particular day, yeah.
And if you did that in South America,
because what you're talking about there is solar noon, and you could do solar noon on any day.
But not necessarily solar noon, because solar noon wouldn't tell me where south and north are.
Well, it would be when solar noon. If we're talking if you get the bear.
Yes, you could. Yes, you could do solar noon. I'm thinking on the equator, because solar noon at the equator, you don't get a shadow. So if you did solar noon for your exact location, that should determine perfect south from north. Would that be correct?
It would determine on that day, yeah, on that one day.
And if on that one day you had somebody from all three of those points determine south, and then using that reference point of what south is, look for the southern pole stars, and if they all
you'd only be able to get two. You'd only get two because one of them's in daylight. So South America would have to be at dawn.
Well, I'm saying throughout the day, because we're not going to do it at the same time. It would have to be solar noon in South America, solar noon in Australia, solar noon in Africa, because you wouldn't do the measurement at the same time, because you have to do solar noon for your physical location.
Sure. And then what's your objective? You're trying to work out what at this point?
My objective would be that if you were able to calculate due south based on solar noon on the exact same day from that one transit of the sun in a 24-hour period. So each three of those points has now identified what, for all lack of a better term, perfect south is. set up a telescope on top of it, aiming at that perfect south, if they are all looking at the same stars, would that conform to a globe?
Yeah, that would be a globe.
Okay.
That would be the evidence that I would accept to be a globe.
I will.
But the problem is, I can then flip that and say, does that evidence exist? And the answer is no, it does not.
No, it
So
does.
by virtue of it not existing, when someone brings up the southern stars, I say, well, what evidence do you accept? And then when we start talking about it, when we get to the point where I say, we're not showing this as empirical because this evidence doesn't actually exist, what normally happens is they say it becomes a semantic argument. But I say it's absolutely essential. Because if you believe, because you wouldn't be able, the equivalence principle from Einstein states that you would not be able to distinguish a force of gravity pulling you down from an upwards acceleration at a constant rate. You would have the same equivalence, right? It's the same principle on the southern rotation point. You can either perceive that the stars are rotating around a pole, but the equivalent position is that you're lying on your back and you're looking up at two rotation points in the sky, but they're like the blades of a Chinook helicopter, and you're looking up on the underside of the blades of a Chinook helicopter that are both spinning like that, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
So would you accept this experiment as evidence if it was done rigorously enough?
This is what I've been asking for years. Okay. I've got Dawn Treader, I've got Chris MCM. This is I've asked for this over and over and over again. And we've got Dazza the cameraman, and we've got Wolfie that are both in America, in Australia. Yep. And we've got Iru Landucci on the flat Earth side, who's in Argentina. So he's in South America. So the only variation would be the height in the sky. Mm-hmm. But if we can establish due south, and we've got somebody in Argentina, and we've got two people in Australia, if we can prove that it doesn't matter about the height in the sky, what matters is where are they looking on the horizon. But if we can get these people to collaborate together and basically prove that they're doing an absolute south direction, which is a hard point in itself. Yep. But if you can satisfy both parties that you're both looking in the same direction, and then get a time lapse photography for say 15 minutes, where you get not time lapse, long exposure for 15 minutes, and you get a little bit of a rotation. What you should be able to see then is that you should see in the center of frame on both pictures. Doesn't matter about north and south where it is doesn't matter center of frame for that bit, but left to right. They should be center of frame, and it should be the rotation point. That's what we should see. Okay. But for whatever reason, it's never happened, and that evidence doesn't exist. Now they all agree that that's what would be required, but it's never happened. Now it should happen, but to argue that the rotation points of the stars in the south prove something without that evidence is fallacious, because we need that evidence to form any conclusions, and that evidence doesn't exist.
Okay.
Do you agree? Can you see?
Yeah, I would agree. I would not necessarily brush aside as easily the people that live there, but I can understand your position that this specific proof should be producible.
But the problem is when you get your solar noon, then what that's then going to conflict with is your compass, because your solar noon and your compass are not going to line up the same.
I wouldn't.
So
you've
got your compass. I would use the compass, because that's not something that is subject to science fucking it up. Because I can argue that declination is an adjustment that they make to allow for the fact that the continents don't line up on a sphere. Now they would say it's declination.
So then how about this? Each site would have 3 instruments. One south based on solar noon, one compass south without declination or adjustment, and one south with adjustment.
So then what you would have is you'd have 3 sets of results that don't support each other from any citation, and what that would do is would give you an ambiguous and unreliable test result, because you've got the compass lining up south, you've got the compass with declination, compass lining up south without declination, and your solar noon, and all 3 of them are different positions.
What if they're
all within 15 degrees?
What if they all looked at the same spot?
Then it would be a globe.
Okay.
Oh, well, they can't though. They can't. All 3 can't.
Oh no, yeah, because the two compasses would be different. So in theory, it should be the solar noon and the declination one should be the same.
Solar noon and declination should be the same, and without declination, it should be different. Correct.
Okay.
That's really the only piece of evidence that we, as the average layperson, without rockets and all that, that's the only one that we really could work on. We could work on that, and I realised that that's needed. You realise, if you're honest with yourself, you realise that evidence doesn't exist and it should be there. But if you've never looked for it, you don't know that it's not there. You have to take my word that it's not. But that is the evidence that's needed, and it doesn't exist. We do have I think it was Daz of the Cameraman or Wolfie that took a time lapse of his stars in the night sky to show that it was a rotation point. And because people were saying, did it just did it whip past you like it was in a straight line? And that was back in 2015 or so. So I think it was Daz of the Cameraman that showed that there is a rotation point in the night sky, and we were like, right, now is it south? Now that's never been established. But we can all agree that if we can establish that it is south for two observers at the same time, it has to be a sphere. But it's never happened, and that's the one thing that I've been banging on for ages, because it rules out flat Earth.
Okay.
It proves globe, and it's the only conclusive thing that I can think of that we can demonstrate ourselves.
I'll write up a proposal, with specific specifications on how the experiment needs to be run. Run it by you to make sure that we all agree on the parameters of it, to make sure that neither of us is being too loose with the definitions of how everything can be run, and make sure that it's sound with the results. Yeah, I will write something up. This is something I would love to make happen.
Yeah, I would love to too. The only guy I know that could do it in Argentina is Iro Landucci.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why it's got to be Argentina and Australia is because if you look at that globe over your right shoulder, you will see that you've got Argentina. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, you've got Argentina on one side, but virtually directly opposite is Australia. So you're getting kind of 180 degrees.
Yeah.
But if you go with Africa, Africa's kind of a quarter of the way around. So you're not quite getting half the globe. You're going to get a rotation point, if it is a globe, of about 90 degrees. But you really want that 180 flip.
See, what we need then is some random island out in the Pacific.
No, you can do Argentina.
Well, I'm just saying, then we can get 4 points. if we can find some random island out there.
There is one guy that lives in Hawaii.
It's not south.
I'm not sure where Hawaii. It's not south.
Yeah,
right.
I lived there for 5 years.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that'd be no good then.
Yeah.
But I mean, we can do it with Iru in Argentina and one of the guys in Australia. And like you say, they need to have a decent compass set up to prove where that is. And then, so you'd say the bearing is that for the compass with declination, the bearing is that without declination. And we worked out solar noon today was on this bearing, therefore south is that bearing. You'd have to know your solar noon for that particular day. But you could do that. And I don't think it'd have to be on the equinox either. It could be done on any day, so long as you knew what your solar day was.
Yeah, and as long as both people did it on, I would suggest both people have to do it on the same day. You wouldn't necessarily,
do it on the same day.
But you wouldn't necessarily, because solar noon should always prove to you what south is. But just for thoroughness, we should do it on the same day.
Yeah, but it has to be on the same day because your solar noon is different to his solar noon if it's any other day. It will change depending on, because it's the orbit of the Earth around the sun.
But they'll both shift at the same rate, won't they?
Yeah, but wouldn't you want it to be the same day to show that there's no shift?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I want it on the same day. Okay.
Yeah, same day. So you got to identify your solar noon position, your bearing of solar noon, and then your opposing position will be your nighttime position. And then once you get your evidence, you get your 15-minute time long exposure of your night sky at that bearing, and then you'd submit your evidence, whoever got it first.
Yep.
And then the other guy, he would get his solar noon, and then he'd get his opposing position at nighttime. He'd take his 15 minutes long exposure. He'd get his, and it'd have to be center of frame. You'd have to show that your camera was showing center of frame. Because even if it's just 10 degrees off one way or the other,
you're not looking at the same south.
In America, you've got a declination of positive 14 degrees, but in Australia, you've got a declination of, I think, I'd have to check this again, but you'd have to check the declinations. But my point is that if you've got 14 degrees one way and you're 10 degrees out because you've just been sloppy with your solar noon direction and whatever, it's going to create you have to be absolute with your solar noon measurements that your solar noon measurements are correct.
I think that's going to be the biggest parameter on this is how you determine solar noon, how you mark it, and how you ensure that when you put your telescope up that you're still pointed at that solar noon.
You don't even need a telescope, you need a P900.
Yeah, true.
Well, actually, no, not the P900, because the P900 is really bad at nighttime exposure.
Oh, yeah, it's shit.
It's rubbish.
I've got a P1000,
yeah, we need a different camera. Because all we need to see, we don't need to see what stars they are. We just need to see that the rotation point after a 15-minute time lapse is in the center of frame when you're pointing in the bearing that you should be pointing at.
Yep.
You don't need to see the stars. You just need to see the rotation point, because that will tell you that it's the same rotation point.
All right. We'll make this happen.
We should do, because that is the evidence that's necessary to prove that it's a... But the problem is, you've also got to get statements from both sides that say, if this works, it can only be a sphere. If this does not work, it can only be flat because one side's going to have to lose.
Yeah.
One side has, because it is, and what's going to happen is that we'll end up in a semantic argument over the meaning of declination, because basically what I think will happen is on a flat plane, it won't line up. But in real world, when we do the observation, it won't line up, and that'll support but not prove, but it'll support the flat plane. But then when you make the corrections for declination, then it'll kind of line up, and then they'll say that's close enough. And then it'll become ambiguous, and it'll prove that neither model are right, because the declination point is what I would say is the adjustment for why the continents don't line up. But if they make the adjustment for declination and the continents then seem to line up, then I would say then we're back to the point of, well, what are we? Yeah. Are we declinating because of a shift in magnetic poles or a shift in magnetic drift, or are we actually correcting because the continents don't line up?
Okay. We'll move on with a couple more questions before we wrap up. But yeah, I definitely want to make this happen. It's an easy enough experiment that should be doable by just regular people.
It's not an experiment. It's an observation, isn't it?
Correction. Yes. Observation. Sorry.
Observation.
I promise we're almost to the end. Come back tomorrow for part 3.